헬레나 선생님을 모시고 저희가 이제 강연을 듣는 시간입니다. Miss Helena Hodge, could you come up to the stage?
So I think I know how to say 안녕하세요, but I don't know. I wish I could speak more Korean, and if I had come here when I was younger, I would be speaking Korean by now, but as you get older, it takes longer to learn. But I'm quite determined to come back. I have been back several times to Korea, and I love your country, I love your people. And so I'll be coming back and learning a little bit more Korean. As many of you know, I have spent a lot of time in a place called Ladakh, which is actually West Tibet. And in that Tibetan culture, almost 40 years ago, when I went there first, I discovered a society that had developed and changed and evolved over hundreds of years, but according to its own internal needs. People had adopted things from the outside, they had traded with the outside world, but they hadn't been colonized, they hadn't been enslaved, and they hadn't been developed in a modern sense with outside economic forces promoting and pushing change. So when I first arrived in 1975, and I learned to speak the language fluently, I found people who were not only very much in charge of their own lives, quite self-reliant, but also I found people who were very self-respecting. In the beginning, I didn't realize that it was self-respect. I just realized that these people looked happier than any people I had ever seen. And I became fascinated. I wasn't going to stay in Ladakh. I came out originally to help make a film. I was a linguist. And then I became so interested in these people and in particularly in what seemed to be such an incredible happiness, so much smiling and joking and a very energetic way of being that was very, very attractive. If any of you have seen, we don't have any slides now, no. If any of you have seen the Dalai Lama, those were very much what people were like. They were like the Dalai Lama, just a sense of humor and joy that was very attractive. So when the film was finished, after 6 weeks of working there, I decided to stay to work on the language. And I gave up my job. I was working in Paris, in France, as a linguist, and started working on what was going to be a doctorate on the Ladakhi language. But really my interest was in the people and in the culture. And as I was researching the language, I went through the whole area. It's a big region in about 100 small villages and some small towns. And I got to know people really quite well. And never, never ever in the first year did anybody say, "We are so poor, we are so backward, we are so stupid." Never. In fact, people said to me, "Have you tried all our different kinds of food?" And, "Oh, you must stay in the winter, because the winter we have basically celebration, the whole winter." They would say, "Zabos tungbos," which in Ladakhi means, we have enough to eat, we have enough to drink. We're self-reliant. But I saw that as I came into Ladakh, so did other foreigners, tourists. And really, this was the beginning of what the Indian government was calling development in Ladakh. Ladakh was being developed. So now the government was spending money to build up roads, to bring in energy from the outside, coal, diesel, fossil fuels. They were bringing in also modern agriculture, which meant pesticides, chemical fertilizers, species of seeds and animals from the outside. And all of this was meant to improve, bring up the standard of living. And tourism was an important part of the development program. So they were also helping to lend money so that people could build hotels and bring in more tourists. And I saw that in a very short time, the Ladakhis, particularly the children, they started thinking that Ladakh was backward, was undeveloped. And what they started doing was to compare themselves with an idea of the Western world, my world. The Western world outside, which they hadn't experienced. They started believing that in the West, we didn't have to do any work. We had unbelievable amounts of money, and we had a way of life that was far superior to their way of life. And very soon, young children, even as early as 4 or 5, were saying things like, oh, it's much better to be taller, and to have lighter skin, to have Western eyes, to be light-haired. Suddenly they were saying, we're ugly about themselves. And what was happening also was that the role models for children at that time were Barbie doll for girls and Rambo with machine guns for boys. And the Rambo was dressed, with T-shirts cut off like this and looking very tough. And the Barbie girls were very, very thin, and they had long painted nails and high-heeled shoes. And suddenly the role models of what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a man, became polarized, exaggerated. And I saw all of this with my own eyes, these changes that started already in the first year, but by the second year more, the third year more, and now I've been going back to Ladakh for almost 40 years. And what Ladakh can help us to understand is more about an economic system that has a profound effect on how we feel on the inside. And so I now, for many, many years, I've been talking about this relationship between a very distant economic system and the inner life, our inner life. How do we feel? Do we feel good about ourselves? Do we feel happy? Do we feel valued? Do we have meaning in our lives? And I have been seeing that most of the people who plan economic change are men. And men in our Western and Westernized culture, even in Korea, even in Ladakh, have tended to be removed from psychology, happiness, this spiritual dimension. They also have very little ecological literacy. They have learned about ideas about how to make the economy grow. How can we get GDP to go up as a politician? Or as a businessman, what's the best thing we can do to bring in profit, to pay the shareholders and the investors? And so I see this very big gulf between the needs of people, particularly our inner needs, and the needs of nature, and the people who are planning change, people who are actually encouraging development, growth, so-called progress. And I really hope that you, as young women, will become interested in this area of economic development, progress, growth, and that you as women will not neglect the psychological inner dimension, that you will not neglect the needs of nature. We need ecological and human literacy in order to be planning for a type of development that has as a goal both human and ecological well-being. You may have heard that in women, the two brain halves are more connected than in the male brain. There is a physiological difference between men and women. Of course, there are many, many exceptions, but there is a general pattern where women have an easier time understanding the connected relationships in the world around us, have an easier time thinking holistically, what also sometimes is called systems thinking. But you have to be careful because you have to bring systems back to social and ecological systems, not just systems that are created by robots and computers using numbers that are symbols of the real world. We have to come back to the real world and to experiential knowledge if we want to be intelligent. Now, after my many years of experience observing a whole society, a whole region, influenced by a global economic system, one of my main conclusions is that it's not intelligent for us to think that we're going to change human beings to adapt to a globalized system. What we need to do instead is to build more localized systems so that human beings and the human brain and the human senses, we're not just brain, we also have senses with which to perceive and understand the world, that we need to scale down the economic systems so that our human capacity to learn in a more holistic way will be able to be implemented. This is different from some men I have seen, quite a few actually, who argue that our brain, both the male and the female brain, is what they call a tribal brain. And what they mean by the tribal brain is that we have evolved perceiving things at this level of experiential knowledge, small scale. And now these men are saying, we've got to hurry up and change the human brain to adapt to the global system. The fact we're having right here in Seoul, when we're drinking this water or possibly drinking this juice, it may have had an impact in Brazil, it may have an impact on Iraq with oil, with the plastic, maybe having an impact on what's happening in Syria. And what do we know? What do we know about that impact? How can we really understand what our impact is in this globalized system? But these men, a lot of men are recommending we've got to change the human brain so the human brain will be able to think globally. I believe, and a friend of mine, Jeremy Rifkin, who was quite a close colleague in ecological and economic thinking, he says something similar. He says that we evolved in tribal, smaller groups, and then we evolved to a higher level, which was the national level, national identity, national thinking. Now the time has come that we've got to evolve one more step to the global level. I completely disagree with that. And I think it's really important that we start questioning some of these assumptions. My experience, not just in Ladakh, but in Bhutan, in Spain, in Sweden where I grew up, in America where I've lived, in relating to almost 50 different language groups that translated our materials, especially Ancient Futures, the book where I describe the changes in Ladakh, and a film that we made by the same title, has been translated into about 45 to 48 languages. And other things have been translated into more. So about 50 language groups have told us that what you describe in Ladakh is what we have also experienced. And in Korea also many people said about the book Ancient Futures, which I hope you will read. I think about 400,000 copies sold in Korea. And many people say this is also what happened in Korea. So I think we're talking here about a very important distinction. Where we are today, how are we going to move forward? How are we going to make real progress? How can we create a situation, a society, a way of life that really genuinely is about serving the needs of people? What are those needs? What are the really universal human needs? And what do we need to do to create more ecological ways of living that don't destroy species of animals? You know, as we're speaking right now, species are being extinguished, never to live again. And we have this huge increase in the extinction of species right now. In fact, I saw some statistics the other day that are really shocking. The exponential increase in extinction. And yet, we have very few big picture analyses that try to look at why is this happening. What we tend to hear, the dominant view, is that, number one, we're in this mess because human beings are greedy by nature. So our greed is multiplying exponentially. We tend to hear that not only are we greedy by nature, but we are also overpopulating ourselves too rapidly. So the population is the main reason why we're destroying so much of the planet. Now again, with these two assumptions, I disagree completely. First of all, I think that overpopulation, in other words, we're now over 7 billion, I think that is a problem. There is a problem that there are so many human beings on the planet, but it is not the reason why we have the extinction of species, or why we also have, at the same time, a widening gap between rich and poor. In every society now, the gap between rich and poor is widening exponentially, very rapidly over the last 30 years. And that includes in my country of Sweden, it includes the United States, it includes every society that I know about. Ladakh is very similar to Bhutan, which you may have heard of Bhutan, where I also worked over a 5-year period and saw identical changes to the changes in Ladakh. And one of those changes is this gap between rich and poor. And along with that gap, again, in every society that I know about, unemployment and job insecurity is also a major problem. Again, in every society that I know of, because of unemployment and job insecurity and the widening gap between rich and poor, people are feeling very scared and very nervous about providing enough money for themselves and their own children. So in that system, people are often becoming more greedy. But their greed is not linked to the extinction of species. Their greed is not linked to a system of consumerism that's being pushed on people to consume more and more things. This has to do with the nature of the economic system, not to do with people's insecurity and their need to earn money, to pay the rent, to pay the mortgage, to pay the education for their children, to pay for their food. We have, as part of this financial insecurity, as you have seen, we also have a tremendous problem of basically an epidemic of depression. Now, you may not realize that this is a global problem. Again, in Sweden, in Spain, in America, there is a growing epidemic of depression, anxiety, along with this greed and focus on how can I earn enough money. I hear very often in Korea people talking about this problem in Korea, but people need urgently to be aware that this has nothing to do with the Korean people. This is not to do with a system that you created. This is to do with a global system. Once you start seeing that you have the same pattern, gap between rich and poor, unemployment, insecurity, depression, suicide, anxiety. In America, the prescription for anxiety drugs is going up like this. I think something like 50% of students your age are taking either anxiety, drugs for anxiety or for depression. I don't know if any of you have an idea what the statistic would be in Korea. Does anyone know? No? But it's quite important to see the truth about a global system having a global effect in different cultures. Now, each culture is different. We have diversity, a diversity of cultures, a diversity of languages. We used to have a political diversity. We don't anymore. But we now still have cultural differences. So everything is not the same in every country because of the mix between the original culture, which was not created by an economic system. The original cultures in different places grew out of a dialogue with natural resources, with the real economy. The soil, the climate, the minerals, the resources. That's what shaped the culture, and why you had different food and different food culture in different areas, different clothing to do with the climate, different architecture, again to do with the resources and the climate. So all our basic needs came from the real economy, the natural world. And we had different races in different parts of the world. All of that diversity was the consequence of a healthy economy, an economy that was based in the local natural resources, the local climate. Today, everything has been flipped around, and you have giant banks linked to giant multinational corporations, and their need for profit is transforming cultures into consumer cultures. Without us being asked, our governments have changed rules, have changed laws, have changed taxation, have changed subsidies, have changed the emphasis on infrastructure. And all of that has been to suit the needs of global corporations, foreign investment, foreign trade. Right now in Australia, the government is trying to take away the welfare in the medical system. They're trying to cut away the free medical care. They're trying to increase the age that you have to work, so you have to retire later. They're trying to take away the benefits for unemployed people. And all the time they talk about, we must do this, otherwise we will lose our AAA credit rating. AAA credit rating. And this is an insanity. Why does a credit agency determine politics? How can a whole government be based on what a credit agency says? How do we end up in debt and worried about the credit agency is about us being able to borrow more money? Who are we borrowing the money from? Where is the money coming from? We really urgently need women to start thinking about these issues, because we need to have a combination of understanding about human needs and ecological needs, as I said, and the ability to think more holistically while remaining grounded and having faith in our experiential knowledge. We're right now at a crossroads where roughly half of the global population has been pushed into cities. I say pushed, it's been pushed and pulled because the jobs have been concentrated in big cities like in Seoul, in Stockholm, in Beijing, around New York, a few job centers which become fewer and fewer with the process of industrial development and then later on shifting into the service economy, the information economy. The concentration of jobs has been centralized more and more. So we urgently need to start looking at what the way forward is. Do we want to follow blindly a system that's based on banks creating the money and lending it to governments, private banks, and credit rating becoming the whole goal of a government, of a society? Or do we want to say, no, society should decide how much money to create, how to put value on that money? We are in a situation where, as I said, all the diversity of cultures came out of the fact that the economy was based on using natural resources. Today, the economy is based on using natural resources. There's nothing here, this microphone, these lights, everything we use comes from nature. Nothing comes out of 3D printing, out of the air. But there are people who believe now that 3D printing creates food and water out of thin air. This is a madness because people are so cut off from the reality, from the whole chain of production to consumption. So we have to, get grounded, and we have to realize that the way to create intelligent systems is actually to move away from a globalized system where we don't see the connection between the thing that comes out of the 3D printer and the minerals and the resources that went into it. We don't see who invested and why they invested. The people who were lending money before 2008, before the financial crash, they were lending money to people they never met, they never saw, they didn't even know their names. They were speculating on the value of debt, and the debt was in envelopes, debt piled upon debt through computer generation. So there was no real intelligence and connection between the creation of the money, the lending of the money, the using of the money, the paying back of the money. It was blind gambling casino. And when this started crashing, then governments said to their people, we've got to keep these banks going. So we have to use money that you pay in taxes to bail out the banks. Many people started saying, it doesn't make sense for the money that I've earned and paid in tax, that should go to big banks that then pay bonuses to people who were gambling, and they're getting $1 million bonus for nothing, for doing nothing, no productive work. So many people said, we need regulation. We need to regulate this rather than bailing it out. But governments were afraid to regulate because the businesses, the banks, and it isn't just the banks, I'll come back to that, but the banks were saying, if you regulate here, I'll go somewhere else and you'll be left behind as a country. And you're not going to get that AAA credit rating. So governments are afraid of the global players, the banks and the Coca-Colas, the Monsanto, Arthur Daniel Midlands, the big pharmaceutical giants. Governments have been saying, okay, I won't look after my people, I won't regulate the environment, I won't keep my water clean, because you as foreign investors and foreign corporations, you have to have the right to come in and out and make money out of our society. I don't believe that most of the government representatives, that we have elected, fully understand what they're doing. What they're following is the idea that free market, free trade, global trade, more trade treaties will create more jobs. I have to try to keep my country growing. GDP has to grow. And they don't look at the big picture the way I'm doing now. And when I try to talk to them, 30 years ago, maybe even 25 years ago, I used to be able to do like a seminar in the World Bank or the IMF, or I met some ministers in different governments, Bill Clinton's chief economic advisor and so on. But not today. Now there's it's very difficult to reach the politicians in power. But in the meanwhile, there is a big movement growing. In America, there's a new economy movement, and the very essence of the economy movement that is starting to demonstrate a different way is the localization movement. And that's what I call the economics of happiness. Localization is happening even though governments are continuing to go down this crazy path. Localization is about shortening distances, particularly around food. Food is absolutely essential for all of us. Everybody needs it every day, and ideally it needs to be fresh. But while our governments are separating us further and further from our food, including the seeds, including the varieties of plants and animals, local groups all around the world are saying, this doesn't make sense. Let's build up local food economies. Let's start farmers markets, edible schoolyards, all kinds of schemes to shorten the distances. And this local food movement is now very big and very strong, even though it had no support from government, from the media, from banks. It was all people power. To the point that, for instance, in Canada, the government of Ontario has put hundreds of millions now to support local food. The New York Times had a Microsoft CEO from Microsoft saying, the future is local. It's not changed government policy yet, except for local government policy. Local government policy is changing. So I see this way that the world now is moving in two different directions. From the top, there's still push towards the global trade, global finance. From the grassroots up, even reaching local government, there is now a localization movement. And there is no doubt whatsoever that when it comes to the real economy, number one, food, but also shelter, clothing, the basic needs, local economies can provide in a far more effective way for our needs without destroying and extinguishing species. The wonderful, wonderful thing about localization is that when you start a farmer's market or a local food market, that market encourages diversity on the land, diversification. It encourages a market where the farmer can sell an apple even if it's only this big, because it doesn't have to fit into a whole chain of machinery, harvesting, washing, supermarket shelves, container ships. What is important for the real consumer is that it should be nutritious and delicious. Suddenly you're creating a market which has the opposite effect of the global market, which pushes monoculture. In the local economy movement as well, there are now studies in America that show that when people shop in these local co-ops or local farmers markets, they have 10 times more conversations with each other than they do in the supermarket. So we're already seeing the sociological and psychological differences. What happens when people are relating to each other in a more human scale way. It's also related to a slowing down. When they shop at the farmers market, the actual experience is enjoyable. It's human scale, it becomes slower, and it actually is not only leading to more social cohesion, but to greater happiness. I just also want to say that in this localization movement, we have local business alliances for all kinds of businesses. We have local banking and local finance that's also being created. And paradoxically, the strongest localization movements are in the United States. And it isn't so paradoxical as it seems, because America was actually subjected to the pressures of corporate rule far more than any other country. In America, the government never looked after its people the way that the Korean government tried to do here, or in Sweden, or in Australia, or even in the UK. They've never had socialized medicine, and what Obama is bringing in is not about people, it's about the pharmaceutical businesses. So anyway, the fact is that it's a very interesting and a very important thing to realize that many of the examples of how to do things in a localized way, including developing new legal structures, is coming out of America. And I think I'm out of time now, but I do just want to stress that we have some very, very good news. And that is that we're not only talking in theory about localization, we can actually bring evidence of the benefits. And that evidence points to the fact that universally what human beings really need and want is love, connection to other people. Around the world, when you ask people what's the most important thing, it's friends, family, good relationships. More and more people are also realizing a need for nature, a connection to nature. There are all kinds of studies now that show that with many people who suffer from depression, if you take them out for a walk in nature, or even better, a longer hike, they will often feel less depressed. Whereas if you take them to a shopping mall, they feel more depressed. There are studies that show when people are in hospital, if they can have a window where they see nature, they get better faster. There are studies that show with old people who are alone, even if they just have a goldfish in a bowl, they will feel happier, connected to life. And this connection is a universal human need. So the good news is that what we actually need is good for nature and is good for us. So there isn't this dichotomy between greedy human beings who are greedy by nature and the need to look after nature, the need to change, going against, the idea being that we would go against our nature to sacrifice and to have a very reduced life. What we're talking about is actually a life that is richer and happier and more meaningful. So I hope that you'll be interested. We want to have in my organization an ongoing dialogue with Korea. If anyone is interested, we would like help with someone who speaks English, who might be a contact between us and Korea. We might end up setting up some kind of NGO in Korea, because we're building up an international alliance for the economics of happiness, for localization. And we very much hope that there will be members from Korea for that network. And so I hope we'll have a good discussion afterwards. Thank you very much. Thank you. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.